Finally.
Good. It looks like it's working. Sophie.
Yeah.
Is it out? Are you seeing it on there?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Good. It looks like it's working. Okay. I have to close that, otherwise there will be a really bad echo. Because there's a delay. So it'll just keep like, it will record me speaking, and then it'll record it on the speaker speaking, and then we tested it earlier and it was really strange. So we're going to try to, so for those of you that are just joining the live stream, so I'm going to have you mute that. For those of you that are joining on the live stream, thank you. Just be patient. We are going to start right at 5. We just wanted to start the live stream early to check for technical difficulties. So thank you for your patience. And while we're waiting to get started here.
What hell is it? We've been living tomorrow. Yeah.
Oh, and I was going to tell you too, Auriel, Marie Perkins wanted to be here. She's ill today, but she was going to introduce you, and she really wanted to, she might be watching on YouTube. I don't know. Hi, Marie, if you are.
So, I hope she's feeling better. That's all right. These things, yeah, there's a lot of illness going around, that's for sure.
Yes, it is. I've known a lot of people who have gotten very sick, and I myself have been sick. I'm going to edit all this out of the recording, by the way.
Good deal.
All of our chit chat. It is 4:57 by my watch. So I'm actually going to bring up my presentations. Scan through this. Well, this, very good. Let's see.
After my, they had it. Getting back. It was my fault. I really. That'd be sick though.
That would be awesome. Just tell my husband. Get out here and watch this awesome presentation. We're going to learn about secretive marshbirds, which don't get nearly enough attention, in my opinion. It's probably because they're secretive. Yeah. Two more minutes by my watch.
It's just like highlights. So it's I love you.
Oh, yeah. It's
six you're getting the bedroom. This is the so like it's easy. I don't know. It's just
you would have done it. So it was like. Because go ahead, that is
No, actually, I think I've seen a different one, but I don't know. I'm like, oh my God, I was like looking, I'm like, oh, no, okay.
All right, well, now we are at 5 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to take a moment first to welcome everybody who's in the room. I'd like to welcome everybody here in the classroom at UW-Stevens Point, and I'd also like to welcome everybody who is joining us via YouTube. Thank you very much for joining us. If you're on YouTube, feel free to enter your comments and questions in the chat at any time, and we will read those off at the end. But right now, as you can probably see on your screen, you are here for the next seminar in the Art of Waterbird and Wetland Management. This is a 7-part series on Thursdays at 5 p.m. So our next one is coming up soon. Let's see here. Let me get to my... There we go. So here's our the total series. Some of our seminars are already available. They've been recorded and are available on our YouTube channel and also on our website at wcw.uws. I'm sorry, at www.uwsp/wcw.edu. So go ahead and check that out. So our next seminar is next week at 5 o'clock in the same place, same time. We'll also have a YouTube link for that as well. And Taylor Finger from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources will be joining us. He is a game bird specialist, and he's going to be talking about the Wisconsin waterfowl habitat conservation strategy in Wisconsin. So talking a little bit more about how these wetlands are managed for waterfowl and how that relates to duck stamp funds and state level duck stamp funds. So please join us for that as well. Should be an interesting talk. I'd like to take a moment to thank everybody who has helped bring this series together. So I would like to thank, first of all, the folks in the College of Natural Resources. We collaborate with them to produce this series. They share these announcements via social media, and obviously we use their YouTube channel, and they provide a lot of support to make this happen. Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, who is the host of this seminar series, we are in part an extension organization, UW Extension. So I'd like to thank them for their support. And I would like to thank, in particular, Ben Settinger, who is our waterfowl specialist and a professor here at UW-Stevens Point, and Marie Perkins, who is also a wildlife professor. Both of them helped me to organize this series. They helped to come up with the idea and find speakers and confirm speakers. And so I'd like to thank them for all of their help on putting this series and making it a reality. And finally, it's an important thing that we do here at UW-Stevens Point. It's an agreement we have with our local tribal communities. The University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point exists upon land inhabited by the original indigenous people of this area, including the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and the many other nations and groups that predate colonial borders. We acknowledge that with colonialization, Native American people have been dispossessed of their lands and irreparably changed by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to those actions. In partnership with the Native American Center, we commit to working together to honor the past, be intentional in the present, and to build our future with truth. And so finally, I would like to, now I got to move this over, don't I? Yeah. Able to see that okay? There's my mouse. Sorry, thank you for your patience, everyone. Are you seeing that okay on YouTube? Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Auriel Fournier, and she is the director of the Forbes Biological Station, which is a part of the Illinois Natural History Survey at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Auriel is a quantitative wetland ecologist and ornithologist who specializes in marsh birds and wetlands research. She completed her Ph.D. studying the fall migration ecology of rails with the Arkansas Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at the University of Arkansas in 2017. She then joined the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network as a postdoc, working at Mississippi State University on using structured decision-making to better integrate bird monitoring. Her research focuses on how we can better manage our wetlands for a wide suite of wetland birds and is often focused on rails and other secretive marsh birds. So with that, welcome, Auriel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm going to start my talk by briefly disappearing to let my dog out of the room. So please excuse me. I'll be right back.
Totally understandable.
I'm so sorry. My husband just got home from work and my dogs were very excited. Very glad to be with you guys here today, though, to talk about marsh birds. These have been a long love of mine. And so today we're going to talk about some really neat natural history. We're going to talk about some wetland science and also kind of talk about how it fits together into how we think about wetland management and wetland conservation kind of across the flyway. Let's see here. Okay, so first I want to tell you a little bit about my field station because I love bragging about my field station. So Forbes Biological Station is one of 7 field stations that's part of the Illinois Natural History Survey. We're located there at the Blue Arrow in Havana, Illinois, so we're along the Illinois River. If you know where Peoria, Illinois is, we're about an hour south of Peoria. And so we do very place-based research here in Illinois, and we've been doing that for a really long time. We celebrated our 130th anniversary last year. And historically, the station has been known for a lot of waterfowl work. We do one of the longest running aerial waterfowl surveys in North America. We do a lot of work on scaup and wood ducks, on Canada geese. And, you know, starting with Heath Higgy, who was the director before me, and now since I've been here since 2019, we've also done a lot of work on marsh birds. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So when we think about marshes and about marsh birds, those can take a lot of different forms, and they can look and be managed in a lot of different ways. Their water can come from different places. The bird communities can change a lot, both seasonally and as the habitat changes over time, depending on how it's being managed. We often think of these wetlands as being very ephemeral, and some of them are, but some of them are also much more persistent habitats on the landscape. A lot of them are dominated with things like sedges and grasses and smartweeds, annual plants that produce a lot of seeds, which is really valuable food, both for some of our marsh bird species, as well as some of our waterfowl and other wetland wildlife. The annual plant biomass is also really important as a source of food for the invertebrates that live in the wetlands, and the invertebrates then are food for the marsh birds. And so annual plants are a really important part of this cycle. Perennial plants are as well. Here is an example with a bunch of lotus, but we can also think about things like cattails and bulrush. So these habitats can look a lot of different ways. The examples I showed you here are all from freshwater marshes. All these photos were from either Missouri or Illinois. But if we look more broadly and start to think about saltwater marshes too, these marshes can look a lot of different ways. And the bird communities that we find there and also how they need to be managed differs a lot. But before we dive into the management piece, let's talk a little bit about what marsh birds are. So secretive marsh birds are a group of birds that have been put together for human purposes, not for taxonomic ones. So secretive marsh birds typically contain the rails, the bitterns, the coots, which are rails, the gallinules, which are also rails, the grebes, and the night herons. So these are a group of birds that live in the same habitats, and they have some similar attributes. Those attributes being that they live in really dense wetland vegetation. They are often pretty cryptically colored. They don't vocalize super frequently. The coot maybe being the exception here. Most people haven't seen most of these birds, but they're not actually like a taxonomic group, right? Like rails, coots, and gallinules are all in Rallidae. But like, so this is a group that like people have put together based on their habitat and their behavior. Secretive marsh birds are wetland dependent species. So, you know, in case it's not obvious from the name, they depend on marshes. And many of them are threatened or declining. Several of these are state listed in Wisconsin and in other states around the Great Lakes. And especially if we look nationally, some of them have even been federally listed, like the eastern black rail. A common attribute of them is that they're difficult to detect, and we'll talk about that more later. It just makes studying them more challenging. And marsh birds are also a really cool way to connect a lot of diverse stakeholders. So some marsh birds are doing quite well. If we think about things like Sora or Virginia rail, those are some of our more abundant rails in North America, and they're actually a game species in a lot of places. And so rails and other marsh birds can be a really cool way to bring together folks who are interested in more of the hunting side of things, along with folks who are more interested in the non-consumptive, either birding or just like being out in nature side of things. So they're kind of a neat way to bring all those things together. That being said, marsh birds are a little bit challenging. And so this is my favorite quote from a book by William Burt. It's all about rails. It's if you think this talk is at all interesting, you'd probably like this book. But you know, everyone who studies rails has more than one moment where they feel like the rails are specifically out to get them. And that is usually because the rails are very good at not being seen, not being heard, not being detected, not walking into the trap. And it can be a real challenge. But with that also comes some really cool discoveries and some really cool opportunities to get to see things in a different way. And so when I was doing my PhD with the USGS co-op unit at the University of Arkansas, I was working in wetlands in Missouri, and we were out at night doing rail surveys. And we were actually trying to catch some rails the one night for a different project. And I was sitting on the back of an ATV. I was banding a rail, and my technicians were, I don't know, 15, 20 yards away trying to catch the next one. And all of a sudden I heard yelling. And when it's in the middle of the night in a wetland, yelling is either really good or really bad. And in this case, the yelling was really good. They were really, really excited. And they come running over to me. And I was like, what? You're running, so you must not have a bird, because that would not be safe for the bird. Like, what happened? And they're like, we saw a rail dive underwater. And I was like, that doesn't seem right. We later discovered that this is a thing that they do, which was pretty cool. So I don't know how well this photo is showing up in the room or on YouTube. And I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but if you look carefully, there's this line below the Sora's eye. That's the surface of the water. So this bird is sitting with just its head poking out above the surface. And we started to notice this more and more over time as we were capturing rails at night. And we eventually got really lucky and actually got video of one diving. So let's all cross our fingers and hope this video works. All right. So this is a video of, we're releasing this bird after banding it. So I think that's my hand. So that's a Sora there. So this bird is gonna swim away from us. It's gonna pause for a second and look around. It's gonna sit there for a second longer. And then it dives underwater. Blows my mind. These birds dive underwater. They will, I don't have photos to show you guys, unfortunately, because it's really hard to photograph these things at night. But they will actually dive under the water and like sit holding onto the vegetation, like completely submerged. We think it's probably a predator like escape mechanism, because if they're under the water, a lot fewer predators are going to be able to smell them or figure out where they are. And so, you know, just in the process of trying to study rails to like better understand wetland management, it's been really fun to kind of get to explore and learn some new things about them, and learn that their habitat is much more three-dimensional than we think it is. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how to study a secretive marsh bird. So if you are out in a wetland and you are trying to count or figure out if a bird is present, and that bird doesn't vocalize very often, is mostly brown, and very rarely flies, you have a limited set of options for how to detect that bird, which can make it really challenging to study them, because we often need to know whether or not they're present or how many of them there are to assess how effective management is for supporting them. And so work done by Courtney Conway and others over the past 20 plus years have developed a really rigorous survey protocol that involves doing something called call broadcast. And so that's what this guy is doing in this photo. On one of the white poles there is actually hanging a speaker. And so we use a set of calls. We actually broadcast them out into the wetland. It's quite loud. And rails, when they hear a rail call, are more likely to respond. So depending on the time of day and where you're at, they don't readily vocalize super frequently, but this increases the chance of being able to detect the bird given that it's there. Which is really cool and has been really helpful. And as a result of Courtney and others' work, the amount of work on marsh birds has really exploded over the past several decades. One of the disadvantages of this method is it's really labor intensive. You have to go out multiple times to a site because just because you didn't hear a bird today doesn't mean that the bird isn't there. So you need to go back several times. And so it gets to be really, really labor intensive. This is still standard use in a lot of places, and it has a lot of advantages. But another method that we've been starting to look at more and more is something called an automated recording unit. And so this can be put out in the wetland, and it records all the sounds happening around it all the time. It's basically a pair of microphones hooked up to a cool little mini computer. And then we can go through and we can listen to those recordings. And so instead of having a short couple-minute time period where we might have a person out there, we can listen all day if we want to. These have been a somewhat limited technology for a while, but with some of the work we've been able to do with machine learning, we've been able to figure out how to better identify the birds' calls in the recordings, and figure out exactly what's going on there, and be able to automate them a little bit more. And so this is a tool that we're pretty excited about, and it can help us answer some different kinds of questions. If we send a person out, 5 or 6 times over like a 2 to 3 month period, we can better understand, is the bird at this place? Depending on the methods we use, we might be able to figure out how many of them there are. But it doesn't really give us the kind of data to be able to look at, like, what time of day are they the most active? What time of year are they the most active? ARUs can allow us to answer those kinds of questions. They can also allow us to look at different kinds of calls and see if the call types change across the season, which can also be a sign of nesting activity. And so this is a kind of a direction that a lot of work in marsh birds is going. But what call broadcast surveys and ARUs aren't good at is helping us to understand migration. And so rails, generally speaking, are pretty small. There are some exceptions. And so a lot of the technology that we use to study waterfowl, these like larger GPS tags, is like just now getting sort of small enough to put on rails. But one of the things we can do is use this collaborative network of towers called MODIS to actually study rail migration. And I'll tell you guys a little bit more about that later from my student Chad's work. But we've been able to really understand more about their migration and how they move and when, which has then involved having to figure out how to get our hands on them, which is a whole kind of other set of challenges. And so this is a walk-in trap that we've used that has an audio lure. These are really effective during the spring. During the fall and the winter, we'll go out and we actually like drag ropes through the wetland and like flush the birds and try to catch them by hand. It can be really, really challenging. But so I go through all of this to kind of emphasize that like there's a lot of different techniques that we use to study these birds, and matching up the right technique with the right marsh bird species at the right time of year is really important. So this is some data that I worked on with Blacksville Bird Observatory in Ohio. And so let me kind of walk you through how this figure works. So we've got Sora at the top, Virginia rail on the bottom, and the green dot is the earliest that species had been detected at Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge prior to this study. So Virginia rails were arriving a little bit earlier than Soras based on the existing information at the refuge. The purple dots represent the earliest that we caught the birds in our audio lure traps. So by using a method that was designed to bring the bird out of the wetland and kind of increase our chances of catching them, in several years, we were detecting these birds at days, if not a week or more earlier than the refuge knew that they were around, which might not seem like a huge deal. But if you have spent any time in Northern Ohio or around the Great Lakes in late March and April, which if you're sitting in Stevens Point right now, you're pretty close to the Great Lakes, you know that is a very volatile time of year in terms of weather. And so if we're thinking about trying to provide habitat for these birds, we don't want to be weeks off in terms of understanding when they arrive, because we might then be too late in getting the habitat into the right conditions for these species. And it also is kind of a weakness or a bias in terms of assessing how they might be impacted by extreme weather, because the most extreme weather at the end of March is different than the most extreme weather at the beginning of April. And so through my work with Black Swamp, we knew that like trying to find the right methods, in this case, using something with an audio lure versus more passive surveys was really important. When I went on to do my graduate work with the co-op unit at Arkansas, we were interested in the fall. So my project was funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Missouri Department of Conservation. And we were really interested in trying to better understand how to manage wetlands during the fall for both rails and for waterfowl. And one of the big problems was that we didn't really know how to study rails in the fall. They don't vocalize much and they don't really respond to the call playbacks, mostly because they've already bred and they're not territorial anymore, right? Like their hormones have come back down, like they just don't care. And so we had to figure out a way that didn't rely on the birds doing something. We needed to go to where the birds were. And so along with my technicians, my first field season, we devised an ATV-based survey. It's kind of ridiculous, but it works pretty well. So hopefully you're seeing on the screen, there's kind of this vertical line moving across this square. And so imagine the square is a wetland and all of these dots are rails. And you might think that that's a lot of rails, but at peak migration, there are a lot of sora in our wetlands. And so basically what we would do is drive these serpentine patterns through the wetland. So that black line is approximating somebody driving back and forth across the wetland. And then as you detect the bird, you record what species it is and how far away from the line you're driving it is. So was it 2 meters? Was it 10 meters? Was it 15 meters? And so if this animation is working correctly for you guys, some of those dots are turning red as this line progresses across the screen. And those are the birds that are getting detected. So we don't need to detect all of the birds to be able to estimate how many there are, but we can use those distances for the detections to estimate our ability to detect birds. If you're interested in the stats, we can talk about the stats at the end. But basically, things that are closer to you are easier to detect, and things that are farther away are harder to detect. And we can account for that in the modeling that we do, and then use the results that we get from these surveys to then say there are 5 sora in this wetland, and there are 150 sora in that wetland. And that then helps us to compare that to waterfowl numbers and to other metrics and better understand wetland management. And so this is a really different kind of survey to do. A lot of the technicians that I hired and trained were used to doing auditory surveys. So they know all of their North American birds. You put them out in a wetland or a forest and they can just start naming things off. And I was like, that's great. I don't need you to be able to hear the birds because they're not going to be singing. I need you to be able to find the birds. So has anyone found the rail in this photo yet? I'll give you a second. It's there. It's hard to find. It's a little bit easier when it's not a still photo because the bird is moving and things like that. But there is actually a sora in this photo. He's hanging out right here. His bill is pointed to the right. I know it seems like pretty ridiculous to expect somebody to find that, but most of the technicians that I had were able to learn it pretty quickly. You get a pretty good search image in your head, and you're able to pick these guys out a couple meters away from the ATV. And so we were able to find the right method for the right time of year and then start to be able to look at these trade-offs in wetland management. So oftentimes in wetland management, we are talking about a problem that I often call the wearing too many hats problem. We want wetlands to solve our flooding issues and our water quality issues. We want to provide habitat for waterfowl and provide hunting opportunity. We want to provide breeding habitat for state-listed marsh birds and amphibians and reptiles and pollinators. Like the list goes on and on and on. And it's really, really difficult because one wetland cannot do all of those things. And so oftentimes when we're talking about wetland management, we're trying to find win-wins. There are definitely many instances where we can achieve multiple objectives in wetland management, but we're also looking at instances where we can't do it all. And so we might be trading off between seasons. Like maybe this year, the goal in this wetland is to manage for good breeding season habitat, and it's not going to be as good in the fall. Or maybe we have to trade off between species. We're going to do something that's really good for mallards, but it's not as good for another species. And part of the reason that we're kind of in this bind is because our baselines have shifted so much. So oftentimes when I take like undergraduate or high school classes around and show them our wetlands here along the Illinois River, they get so excited, which is always great. Love when people are excited about wetlands. But they're like, oh, there are so many wetlands here. And I'm like, yes, but no, like there should be so many more. And trying to help people wrap their heads around what we've lost is really hard. And I'm not trying to like be a huge downer here, but I think it's important to understand that part of the struggle of wetland management is if we had the acreage of wetlands that we would have had, 300 years ago, we wouldn't need a wetland to wear 15 hats, right? And so I think this map is pretty chilling, pretty compelling. So these are wetlands in need of drainage from 1919. So each of those dots is basically an area of wetland that is not yet drained. And so at that point, you can see we'd already lost a lot of our wetlands in Illinois. Unfortunately, thankfully, there's still a lot of dots in Wisconsin, so that's good. We've also gone through this like really big philosophical change, right? 1919, not that long ago, when we did not see wetlands as valuable habitat. In the first half of the 20th century was also a time when we saw huge changes to our river systems, which is where a lot of our wetlands occurred as well. So this is the Illinois River, and these different polygons here in the different colors along the river are our drainage and levee districts. So basically these all were wetlands. And we built these really huge and impressive levees. We built locks and dams, and we cut a lot of the floodplain off from the river. And as a result, we lost a lot of those wetlands. Some of these drainage and levee districts have been restored back. But when when I take students along the Illinois River, I'm like, yes, here's this really cool wetland. All of these around here are also supposed to be wetlands. It kind of helps people to understand like part of the bind that we're in. Like we're trying to do a lot of things on not a lot of ground. And as a result, we have to do a lot of really active management. And so we do a lot of water level manipulation. We do a lot of soil and water disturbance. A lot of our wetlands have been cut off from their natural hydrology. So that natural flood dry cycle that you would see in a riverine system, or the natural cycles that like Great Lakes coastal wetlands would go through. And a lot of our wetlands are in things called impoundments. So this image here on the right is from Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge. This is in north central Missouri. And these like linear lines that you can see around these wetlands are levees. And so those allow us to control the water in one of those cells separately from the others, which can be really helpful if you're trying to create different conditions in different places, because we know that birds need different things. But it also means that we've like separated these wetlands from their landscape, which can be necessary if the hydrology has been so messed up. But it involves a lot of tractors to do all the soil and vegetation disturbance, which is often our attempt to imitate the natural disturbance that would have happened from extreme flooding events or from fire. And so wetland management is really often quite labor intensive. And so, we need to understand how to apply that management in such a way to get the habitat that we want at the time of year that we want for the right species. And so that's where a lot of my dissertation research came in. So to kind of orient you to this figure, so we've got the 12 months of the year along the bottom. The blue distribution was kind of the water depths of wetlands, a lot of places in Missouri where I was working. The light gray distribution is roughly the distribution of waterfowl, or at least migratory waterfowl. And then the dark gray distribution is Sora. And so you can see that the Sora, was the most abundant rail that we found in my surveys, is migrating earlier than most of the waterfowl. There's certainly some overlap, but if we're timing water depth management to be on time for ducks, we're missing most of the rails. We did several years of surveys in Missouri. We found this finding. Sorry, it's not the most eloquent way of saying that. And we wanted to try to better understand, like, does it have to be this way, basically? So we worked with MDC and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and got a bunch of managers from several different state conservation areas and national wildlife refuges to do an experiment with us. So we identified two wetlands on their properties. One, they flooded up early in August for like in something we were calling like rail management, flooded a little bit earlier, get it in good condition for the rails. And the other one they did kind of normally, flooding it up in late September or October for the ducks. And what we wanted to do was compare the abundance of rails in those two wetlands and the abundance of waterfowl. So could we do something that we think is going to be better for rails, and what is the impact on ducks? So we ran that experiment for 3 years. And we basically found that flooding wetlands earlier resulted in more use by sora and other rail species. And we had basically the same use by waterfowl, which is an exciting result. This was not the result we were expecting, but it is always nice to find these like win-wins, right? So we can flood wetlands a little bit earlier. We can support a more diverse wetland bird community. And we can still achieve a lot of our kind of core management goals of providing habitat for migratory waterfowl and still providing that hunting opportunity as well. So this was a thing that I was really excited about. Some of my friends in grad school were like, congratulations, you showed that a wetland bird likes water, which is perhaps a less positive way of describing my entire dissertation. But through kind of further work, we've kind of dug into this question about what water level management looks like and how it impacts different birds. So this is Stephanie Schmidt. She did her master's at the U of I with myself and TJ Benson. She now works for the International Crane Foundation in Wisconsin. And she looked at least bitterns along with a couple other marsh birds and looked at how water level management impacted daily nest survival of these birds. So for this graph here, the DSR is the daily nest survival. So the probability that that bird or that nest will survive for a single day. And then on the x-axis on the bottom is water depth. And so as water gets deeper, we see higher daily nest survival, which for a state-listed bird is what we want to see. And so what we think is going on here is that in instances where there is more water, I should explain. Least bitterns build these really cool hammock nests. So their nests are actually like in the cattails. I should have put a picture, like hanging above the water. And typically when the bitterns build them, there is water underneath their nests. But in some instances, water is either being actively removed from the wetland throughout the breeding season, or it's just evaporating. And so the water level gets lower and in some cases completely dries out under the nest. And so what Stephanie found was that the deeper the water was under that nest, especially throughout the entire season, the better those nests did. And we think that this has a lot to do with predators. Stephanie was putting these little cameras on her nest to look at what predators were coming in and munching on the eggs and on the chicks. And when the water is low, we see a lot more mammals. When the water is high, we almost only see snakes. So it's not that there's no predators when we have higher water, but the predator community changes and is a lot less diverse when we have that higher water, because just some of the mammalian predators aren't interested in being out in those deeper water areas. And so this kind of presents an interesting kind of trade-off problem, because if we manage water levels to support least bitterns, the habitat isn't going to be the best for migrating rails and ducks in the fall. Because if we keep the water high through the whole summer, the vegetation communities that the rails and the ducks need for the fall isn't probably going to be there in those wetlands. So, like thinking back to when we had all of these wetlands across like the entire landscape, this would not have been such a big problem because we could have had some good wetlands over here for bitterns, some good wetlands over here for ducks, everything would have been fine. But now we're kind of forced to try to figure out how to do all these things in the same place. And so we're doing some more work now to try to better understand how we can manipulate water level management to support least bitterns and some black-crowned night herons and some of our other marsh birds, and hopefully demonstrate what the waterfowl benefit is of those management actions. We know it's not going to be quite as high as the traditional methods, but hopefully there is still some benefit, and then we can factor that into our trade-offs. So lots of trade-offs when we think about water level management. There can also be trade-offs when we think about things like prescribed fire, when we think about things like pesticide or herbicide application, soil disturbance, all different kinds of things. All right, but let's talk about like migration for a little bit. Migration is something that I have found absolutely fascinating since I was a little kid, and it's a lot of fun to study. Marsh birds are really fun slash strange in that they have different migration strategies, sometimes within the same species. So typically when we think about birds, we think about birds that either migrate or do not migrate, right? It's actually a lot more complex than that, which is kind of the typical science answer. But marsh birds are really cool because there are some species like black rail and king rail where part of the population migrates and part of it doesn't within the same species. So, excuse me. This map on the right is for king rail. So the red represents the area of migratory king rails, and then the purple represents the resident area. And so the migratory birds come south and actually overlap with the resident birds during the winter. And we find this in several different marsh bird species. You know, there's a little bit of clapper rail that does this too. There's some interesting things going on with least bittern that we like still don't fully understand. And so marsh bird migration is a really fun thing to get to dig into just because there are species that have these different strategies as well. So how do we study marsh bird migration? You know, we've already talked about some of the general problems with trying to detect them. Some of the traditional methods for studying their migration don't work super well. Bird banding is certainly a tool that can be used with rails, but they're encountered so infrequently that you don't really get a lot of information back on those birds. I don't know if you all are familiar with geolocators. They're these really cool tags you can put on birds that record day length. And can help you estimate bird movements, but you have to recapture the bird. And marsh birds have very little sight fidelity, so they don't come back to the same places year after year, which makes getting the tags back really hard. A lot of the transmitters that we use are too big for our rails, unfortunately, though that is rapidly changing as battery technology improves. And so a lot of the work that we've done today has been with MODIS towers and with stable isotopes. And you guys have Marie at Stevens Point, so I assume you've heard a lot about stable isotopes because Marie has done a fair bit of it. And so I'm going to talk about MODIS today. If you guys have questions about stable isotopes, I'm glad to talk about that too. I've certainly used it and applied it to rails, but we're going to talk about MODIS. So MODIS is a collaborative network of telemetry towers. So this is Chad Kramer on the right. He finished his master's with me and Mike Ward last year at the U of I. And so he was putting tags on Sora and Virginia Rail, and these tags are coded so they work with this larger collaborative network of towers. So all of these towers are maintained by different partners in the network. We have some in Illinois. You know, individual like Audubon chapters have towers, state agencies have towers. Like it's really a big network. It's maintained by Birds Canada, which is this big nonprofit in Canada. And if you put out tags that work with the MODIS network, everybody's towers can detect them. And so if our birds fly by somebody else's tower, it doesn't happen instantaneously, but we will eventually get those detections back and we can better understand like what is going on with bird migration, which is really cool. And the network of towers has really been growing in the Midwest over the past 5 years or so, which is really exciting in terms of being able to look at rail migration kind of here in Illinois and in the Mississippi Flyway. And so Chad was looking at a bunch of different questions for his master's. The stuff I'm going to show you today is just looking at like regional migration patterns, which is really kind of some of the first work that's been done on this. And I just geek out about it so much. It's so cool. So let's look at some maps. All right, so this is the map for Sora. So just to kind of orient you, that red dot in Illinois there, that's the Emaquan Preserve where all these tags were deployed. And then the blue lines are the spring migrations. So all these tags were put out in the spring. The blue lines are going spring, and then the orange lines are coming down in the fall. And so it's a bit messy to look at. This is a lot of individual birds. But the general pattern that I want to show you is that with the exception of the one bird that for some reason went to Eastern Ontario, most of our rails are going northwest. So if you're familiar with the Illinois River at all, it runs roughly from Chicago down to St. Louis. So it's running from northeast to southwest. And a lot of people talk to me about like, oh, like the birds must like use the river as a highway. And there's probably some truth to that in terms of like local movements, but when they're making migratory movements, we have radar research done, you know, going back decades now that shows that when the ducks leave, they get up and they go northwest in the spring. And now we know that for the most part, the rails do too, which is pretty cool. So these birds are not necessarily using these landmarks as part of their navigation, or at least they're not following them if they are using them for navigation. They're instead kind of heading straight towards where you would expect them to head, which is up to the prairie pothole region where most of these birds are breeding. And then in the fall, they're coming back down through. One of the things I want you to look at in this one is in the fall, we have sora that are going over to the east coast of the United States. You're not going to see that in this next map. So this one is for Virginia rail. We see similar patterns with the spring, right? These birds are going mostly northwest. But in the fall, all of our fall detections are kind of within the Mississippi Flyway, all right? We're not seeing Virginia rails going over to the Atlantic coast. And that to me was really interesting. It's especially interesting in the light of a previous MODIS tagging study. So this map on the right here is from Nicole Hensk, who was a master's student of Bob Gates's at Ohio State several years ago. She put out some tags like this at Winus Point in northern Ohio. And so her map of her detections is there on the right. Chad's detections are on the left. And there's not a lot of overlap in where these birds go. And there are some sampling related reasons that might be the case. But I think that it's really interesting, and it's something that I'm hoping to dig into more, because what we might be seeing is that there might be these like flyways of rails, for lack of a better word, right? Like maybe the birds that are coming up through Ohio and the eastern Great Lakes are taking a different migratory pathway and going to a different place than the birds that are coming up through Illinois and Wisconsin and going to the prairie potholes, which just like scientifically is very interesting. But also in terms of thinking about where we need to put habitat on the landscape and how we think about threats and risks to these species across space and time is really important as well. And so we're hoping to dig into this more in the next couple of years and get a really big tagging project going, hopefully, across a big chunk of the eastern US to look into some of these patterns. So yeah, anyway, I just love looking at migration maps and think that, this kind of stuff is really cool, even if it's just kind of the first scratch of the surface. Okay, so I have thrown a lot at you guys and glad to take questions, but just kind of to summarize, I think that marsh birds and marshes are really cool. I hope that you do as well. We've lost a lot of our wetlands, and so the ones that we have left are incredibly precious, and we need them to do like triple duty to support both our human needs and our environmental needs. And that means that a lot of like local work and regional work and international work is needed to conserve the birds and the habitats and make sure that the whole system remains connected. And so, I think that marsh birds can be a really cool kind of poster child for that because they're really fun and they're really goofy. And I think that when people have a chance to like get a good look at them, they're like, wow, that bird looks really strange, and they want to know more about it, which is always fun. So I want to say thank you. This kind of work is not done in a silo by any means. So tons of funding supports this work. The vast majority of it is federal. Some of it also comes from some of our state partners. And then there's tons of NGO and academic partners as well. You can't work across as big of a geography without that. And yeah, I am glad to take questions, which I believe Jennifer is going to help me with so that I can know what people are asking.
Yes, I am going to help you with questions, hopefully. So we're going to start with questions in the room. And so we're going to start back here. The question is, how often do you encounter yellow rails where you're working in Illinois?
So we've encountered them 3 or 4 times over the past couple of years. We weren't specifically looking for them. We were going out in the fall trying to catch sora and Virginia rail for kind of a sister project to Chad's Masters. And so based on my PhD work, yellow rail migration is really short. So like soras and Virginias migrate from like early August to like the end of October, at least in Missouri. But like yellow rails come through in like a 2.5 week period. And that's and the birds in Illinois are coming through during that 2.5 week period as well. So it's a pretty abbreviated time, like the very end of September, first 2 weeks of October. So they're definitely coming through. If we targeted them, I bet we could find them more because they tend to be a little bit more wet prairie-y, whereas like the soras and Virginias are in more of like the true marsh. But yeah, yellow rails are fantastic. I'm a big fan.
Are they the one that has that knocking call?
Yeah, like the marbles getting knocked together. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think we we heard one in Schmeekley last year, was it?
Nice.
It was really, oh, 2.5 years ago. Okay, but it was really, it was a surprise. Any other questions in the room? Jason?
It looks like Central Wisconsin admitting a Motus tower. So if we were to put one up, what's the detection radius for the?
So Jason is asking, he's noting that Stevens Point does not have a Motus tower, and this might need to be fixed. If we were to put one up, what is the detection radius of those?
It depends a lot on where you're putting it. So yeah, generally speaking, we talk about like 10 kilometers or so. But like we have one antenna array that's on top of a fire tower at a national wildlife refuge, and we think we're detecting birds a lot farther out from that. But that's also like 8 stories in the air. So it really depends on like how high up you're getting the antennas and what the landscape is like around them. Like some of our towers in Illinois, we have pretty low to the ground and like down in the wetlands because we're trying to detect birds locally. And they work well for our questions, but they're not doing a great job of like picking up like other birds migrating through the area. So it really depends a lot on the context. But yeah, I mean, more towers in the network is always an exciting thing. They're not just like plug and play though. They require some maintenance and stuff, but I'd be glad to chat about that if folks are interested.
Excellent. Any more questions? Yeah.
What kind of mammals are breeding on nests when the water is?
You mentioned the survivorship of nests when the water level is high for, was it least bitterns? What type of mammalian predators are you seeing depredating those nests?
Yeah, it's primarily raccoons, and some rats. So
Interesting.
yeah.
I guess that's not, it shouldn't surprise me, but it does. So, Norway rats, not muskrats, right?
Correct.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
Compared to like hiring a person to go out on that like more frequentness of like hearing for like, calls.
Do you find that the audio recording units are more cost efficient than sending technicians out to do the audio surveys by, I guess, manually, for like a better way to say it?
Yeah, yeah. I think we're getting to the point where soon it could be. So we've done a lot of work down in the Gulf comparing in-person surveys to the audio recordings, especially for eastern black rail, because it's a federally threatened bird, and so we need to be able to monitor for it at a scale that would just not even be vaguely possible with in-person people. And the ARUs are not quite as good as the in-person folks. So that's something like they're good. They're just like not quite as good. And so you have to like take that into account too in terms of study design. But like we've been working for the better part of 3 years to refine the machine learning algorithm and like validate it. And we are like just now ready to like maybe deploy it without the in-field validation piece. So there's a huge amount of upfront work to validate what you're doing. But soon we should be able to do it more cost effectively than the field technician piece. There's still a lot of advantages to having the field techs out doing the surveys for the other kind of information you can collect. But if you're talking about trying to, survey an entire military installation in the Southeast for black rail, that's just not really possible. So yeah, definitely some trade-offs.
Jason has another question.
What software are they using for their machine learning?
What software are you using for the machine learning?
Yeah, so we're working with BirdNet. We were originally working directly with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and then a while back they actually made that available via their Raven Pro software. So now we're doing it all through Raven Pro.
Okay. Other questions? There are some. Okay. I have one other question, or actually, let's do the online ones first. So I was going to ask that. So the question is, do you have a favorite marsh bird?
Oh, that's not a fair question. I really like soras. I mean, they were the main focus of my dissertation. They're just very fun, and yeah, I don't know. But I could easily talk myself into literally any of the rest of them, though.
A close second. Um,
A close second, you said?
yeah, do you have a close second?
Um, it's probably yellow rail. They're really fun, and like I wasn't supposed to find them during my PhD, and then I started finding lots of them, and so that was just like a very magical season of me being like, I have a bunch of yellow rails, and people were like, no, you don't, and then I started bringing people out into the field, and they were like, oh, okay, so, so yeah, they're a good one.
There are some approving nods from people in the room. Anybody else? Any other questions online? I wanted to ask a question about the ATV serpentine surveys you were doing.
Yeah.
Is that is when you're detecting them, is it because you're flushing them, or are you going slow enough where you're seeing them in the grass?
It's a combination of both, but you're mostly seeing them in the grass. Like you're driving an ATV at about the pace that you would walk. The reason that we did ATVs instead of walking is because if you walk, the birds will mostly run away from you at night. But like the noise of the ATV engine like covers you enough that you can actually get close enough to them to like see them before they've moved. So we did a lot of telemetry to like verify that. And that's a pretty important part of the statistical framework for the distance sampling. So we needed to like detect them roughly where they were naturally, not with us having like pushed them all to the other side of the wetland. So
Interesting. Part of the
yeah.
reason I ask is I have a follow-up question. Is I wonder if that could be adapted using drones, and then I wonder if that would be less disturbing, or do you think that that would not, like drones with thermal imagery, or even I know there's been some work with machine learning with using videoing in some areas and training the machine learning to find the birds in the videos. Any thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
So my colleague Chris Butler, who's now at Texas A&M, has done some really cool work with detecting rails from thermal imagery on drones. So that's definitely an option. I don't know if it was an option almost a decade ago when I did my PhD. But it now is. Like the technology has come so far, right? And yeah, I mean like driving ATVs through wetlands continuously is disruptive. And it only works in certain wetlands. Like if you tried to do that in a salt marsh, your ATV would just sink into the muck and you would never see it again. So yeah, I think finding less invasive ways to do that is really key. I don't know that I'll ever do surveys like that again, though it was a lot of fun.
Oh, interesting. Well, that was the last of my questions. Anybody else have anything else? Okay, anything else online? Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. I thank you to everybody in the room for joining us. And there is, yes. So thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for participating in our seminar series, Auriel. This was a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it, and we definitely had a couple giggles.
Good.
And thank you again, everybody, for being here. And don't forget, we have an awesome presentation on Wisconsin's waterfowl conservation strategy in Wisconsin. Redundant, but you get my point. Next week, this same time, same place. Please join us. All right, thank you.
Awesome.
All right. So
Thanks so much, Jennifer. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for participating. I really do appreciate it. So
yeah,
I'm going to
sorry I couldn't be there in person, but it was still good. So
nope, completely understand. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the meeting now. I'm not sure how to stop the live stream without stopping the meeting.
Yep.
All right.
Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Have a good one. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.